Hi guys, Viking Guitar here. We're going to do a quick video today on some things that you can do in Reaper with EZdrummer to make your drum tracks sound a lot better, or at least more versatile than they do coming straight out of the EZdrummer box. So first off, let's take a look at what we're using here. We've got the standard EZdrummer Pop Rock kit. I just loaded a fresh instance of the effect right there. I didn't change anything in the mixer, didn't change anything on the screen here, any of the samples, none of that. So it's just standard EZdrummer Pop Rock. And since I'm a stupid metalhead, this is a stupid metal drum pattern, but let's take a listen to it first, just before we start tweaking it. Let me show you a few specific things I did in terms of the individual MIDI items here that really add a bit of liveliness to the drum patterns in the first place. This is stuff you can use when you're writing your own drum patterns that might help it sound a bit more real life. Taking a look at this first pattern here, it utilizes a kick, a snare, a crash, and these closed hi-hats. Now if you right-click on the hi-hat line, it'll highlight all of the individual hi-hat notes. And we're going to take a look at the velocities down here. We could have these all played at the same intensity, but if we vary it up a bit with this pattern here, it makes it sound a bit more like an actual drummer is playing it. And the pattern we're following is kind of a high mid-strength on the downbeat, a very low strength on the upbeat, and then a full intensity on the second downbeat. So if we just listen to the drum pattern with just the hi-hats, we're going to copy this note over to make it sound full, here is what that sounds like. Now, as you can see, it's a lot more lively than just a bunch of straight notes going through. So that's one thing. Another thing is, over here on the drum roll, I've varied the velocity on almost all of the notes in the drum roll here, between the snare and the toms and all that. Usually ascending with the snares, or just a little bit of variation with the snares, and then starting heavy and doing a little descending on the tom hits. To me, it just sounds a bit more natural that way, but keep in mind, I'm not a drummer, so I really don't know what I'm talking about. This is just what I've become used to using in terms of my velocities with my drum rolls, and I think it sounds pretty good. Last thing we're going to take a look at here is over at the end with this last pattern here. What we've got is we've got a kick line that starts heavy for the downbeat to kind of solidify where the beat is, and then slowly ramps up towards that final crescendo end. And I've done the same thing with these toms here. Both of these have the same velocity pattern with them. But when we listen to this, it doesn't sound a whole lot like a drummer's actually playing it, because all of these notes, each kick, the floor tom, and the rack tom too, are all being hit at exactly, and I mean exactly, the same moment in time, which is not how a drummer is going to use it. Now there's a couple ways we can change that, but we're going to get into that in a minute. First off, what we want to talk about is how EZdrummer doesn't initially let you apply individual effects to the individual drums. There's a way to go in through here, and if you open the mixer, you can change this output stuff and set that up in Reaper to route these to different tracks. But I never learned how to do that, and frankly, I don't care to learn, because I have a different way to do it. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to glue all these bad boys together. Highlight them all, right-click it, go down to Glue Items, and now it's all in one individual drum line. And what we're going to do is we're going to add separate tracks down here. This first one we're going to call Kick, and you add a new track by double-clicking in the empty space. Second one is going to be Snare. Third one is going to be Toms. Fourth is going to be Hats. Fifth one is going to be cymbals. And you can make these as specified as you want. If you're going to want to apply different effects to each individual tom drum, you can set up tom 1, tom 2, floor tom, all that. Right now, they're just tracks with labels on them. We're going to go up to this main EZdrummer line here, and we're going to click this button right here that determines whether this track is a normal track or a folder. And that's basically going to tell it that all of these little tracks here are subsidiary tracks to this top track, and all of this stuff is going to be routed through this main effect right here, which is important. We're going to go down to the last one. We're going to click it twice so it shows that this is the end track in that folder. So if we start adding other stuff, it doesn't include it in the EZdrummer track folder also. Another thing I usually like to do before I go any further is I create a new track, I mute it, I select this full MIDI line, I copy it, and I paste it so the timing is the same. And I just keep that there in my back pocket. Usually label it drum MIDI data with an A instead of an E. And I just hold on to that in case in the ensuing steps, if I screw something up here, I can go back and I have my original unaltered line down here. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to take this MIDI line and we're going to make instances of it on each of these child tracks here. Now each one is going to be routing up through the same EZdrummer effects line here, so we don't need to copy that effect over to the individual tracks. But first off, what we're going to do is we're going to address this issue over in this region here, where we have this ascending tom kick line where all of it's being hit at the same point, and it sounds very mechanical and very unlifelike. Now, one way to go about changing this is we can select each individual note. We can go down to the grid thing here and set it to 1/128, which basically is the smallest amount of movement we can have. And we can individually move these little notes off. So when we look at it normally, there's a little bit of variation for each one. However, we'd have to do that with each individual note that we want to change, and that takes a lot of time. And the other downside to it is that it really kind of forces you to be creative in a way that you might not be able to be. It's one thing if you're just doing, 8 notes here or 7 notes, but if you're doing this over an entire song, you're going to start using the same quote-unquote randomization movements, and it's really not going to sound that human in the long run. So the quicker and easier, and in my opinion, way to do this, is to highlight everything, Control A, and this is it's something you're probably going to want to do for the whole drum line because it's a human drummer that you're trying to replicate here, I'm assuming, and you want to have this sort of thing. So highlight the whole thing. If you go to Edit or hit Alt-E, go down to Humanize, you have this option here to humanize the notes. And what this is going to do, we'll zoom in so you can see it as we do it in real time. What this is going to do is this is going to add a randomization to the timing and the velocity based on your specifications. And you can do it to all notes or selected notes. So I guess we don't have to select them all in the first place. But if you look down here at where the notes are as I move this timing thing around, you can see them moving. And if you set this up to 100%, it's obviously going to be so off that it's going to sound like, you don't know what you're doing in the first place. This timing bias here is just going to shift the whole thing left or right, so let's not mess with that. Obviously, we don't want 100% timing variation. Usually, I tend to do about 6 to 10%, depending on the tempo. If we have a really fast tempo, that percentage isn't going to be noticed as much, but if we have a slower tempo, we don't want to go too far into this because it'll really be augmented. Also want to adjust the velocity a little bit, and that'll just change the levels of the intensity that the drums are hit at, once again to kind of simulate a human doing it. I usually set this anywhere between 10 and 15 depending on what I'm working with. So click OK, and now when we listen to that part, it sounds a bit more human. Maybe a bit too human, but for the sake of argument, there it is. In fact, let's change it just a little bit. Let's humanize it, and instead of a 10% timing thing, let's just make it 5. There we go. All right, so we've got this whole glued drum pattern, and we've got it humanized, so it's going to sound about as human as we can. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move this down to the kick, we're going to copy it, set the cursor at the same point, all the way to the back, make sure your snapping is on, copy it there, go back, do it for the toms, do it for the hat, and do it for the cymbal. Now at this point what we have is we have all these 5 individual tracks all routing through the main track up here, and all of them are sending all of the drum hits, so this isn't what we want at all. Let's start with the kick track here. What we're going to do is we're going to double click it to open it, and the downside to doing this is it doesn't automatically reload the note names. So go back into custom note names, load note names from file, go down to your pop rock drum map, and I've included a link to that in this video. And now you're going to know what you're dealing with. So if you hold Alt and use the mouse wheel, you can zoom in or out depending on which direction you go. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to erase everything in this line except the kick. So the easiest way to do that is to zoom out so you can see the entire timeline. Right click over in this gray area to the left, and you're going to highlight everything that isn't the drum track for the kicks and erase it. So at this point, the only information is the kick drum. Now we're going to open the snare thing. We're going to waste our time loading the pop rock map again. We're going to zoom down, and we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to erase everything except for the snare. Then we're going to do it with the toms. We're going to do it for the hats. And I know it looks like this is a pretty tedious process, and it can be, but once you get it down to a pattern, it really doesn't take too long. And the effects are very much worth it. And lastly, we're going to do it for the cymbal line. The cymbal line's a bit trickier sometimes because the cymbals are hidden all over the place. In addition to right-clicking and dragging to select stuff, you can also just right-click on the individual instrument line and erase it that way, which is a bit more precise than doing it this other way. What are you? You're a crash. Now I accidentally erased, it looks like this is a hat line. Or no, I didn't actually, so forget about that. So now what we have is we have just the kick line, just the snare, just the toms, just the hats, and just the cymbals. At this point, we're going to want to render these to individual wave files so we can apply effects to them. You could apply your effects now and then render them individually, but that kind of limits what you're able to do with it later. And if you're playing around with mixing, if you're not exactly sure what your EQ is going to be, I recommend doing it dry and then changing it later. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to mute everything except the kick track. We're going to right-click on the parent track up here. Now this is very important. When you render it, don't render this individual track, because if you just render this, all you're rendering is empty MIDI data and it's not routing it through any effects. So make sure everything is muted except the parent track and the track you want to render. Right-click on the parent track, go to Render Tracks, to Stem Tracks, and there we go. Now we have this line, which is just our kick line. And let's listen to that. You can see it's just the kick drum. So double click it, change it to kick or kick stem or whatever you want. Mute it. The thing about Reaper is a lot of times when you're rendering stuff, the speed of the render is really going to be affected by what else is going on. And that includes extra tracks that just have a wave on it or wave and effect. So if I'm going to be rendering a bunch of stuff like all these individual drum lines, I usually make sure these are the only things that are active because it'll go a lot faster. So you rename your kick track, you mute it, unmute the parent track in EZdrummer, mute the kick track and unmute the next one. So now at this point all we have is a snare line going through EZdrummer, and we're going to once again right click on the parent track, go to Render Tracks, and now we have a snare. Name it snare stem or whatever you prefer. Unmute, mute the snare, unmute the toms, so now just the toms are going through. Right click on EZdrummer, go to Render. And we're just going to repeat this whole thing for the last two tracks, for the hats here and then for the cymbals. Now because I'm anal retentive at this point, since I'm not going to be using this EZdrummer line at all, I turn off the effects to free up some memory, I make sure everything on it is muted, and then I click this button over here a couple times to minimize it so that it's not taking up any space I don't want it to look at. So now, if I unmute all these things, we're going to have the exact same drum line that we did earlier, except each one is on its own individual line now. At this point, we have freedom to apply individual effects to any of these instrument lines without affecting the other ones, which is really nice. Now, we're not doing a mixing EQ tutorial here, so we're just going to add a few little things real quick, like just trying to demonstrate the point. We're going to turn that down, maybe beef that guy up to make it a little clicky, turn that down so we don't get too much boominess, and that's going to be for the kick. I have no idea how this is going to sound. It's just kind of to demonstrate the fact that you can make it sound different, which is really the whole point of this thing. Do that. We'll leave the toms alone for the hats. We're going to really bring up the ultra mid-highs there a bit, make it way tinny. In fact, we'll just make this guy a high pass. And you know what, we're going to apply the same thing to the cymbals. So now it sounds like this. This is cool too if you're doing something that's going to sound a bit more affected in some way. If you want to add delay or something to one individual track, you can do it just to the snare. Turn it up so that it sounds really noticeable, and now it's... You don't have to worry about it affecting everything else. So in my opinion, this kind of sounds crappy right now because of my really quick EQing, but the point is you can do it individually. But we're not done yet. We got something else we're going to do. We're going to add a new track, drag it up to the top, and we're going to make that the parent track of all of these stem tracks. What we're going to do is we are going to call this drum bus. And we're going to add another track underneath. We're going to call this drum comp. Now, Reaper is cool because it lets you route stuff in to other tracks. So we're going to take this drum comp track. We're going to click the I/O button here for the routing, and we're going to send it to receive stuff from the kick stem, from the snare stem, from the tom stem, from the hat stem, and from the cymbals. We're going to make sure these are all post-fader, so we maintain the volumes of that we initially had. We're going to close that guy out. We're going to solo this track. And now when we listen to it, it should be playing all of these other tracks here. Excellent. And what we're going to do is we're going to open the effects window here. We're going to go to the Concos stuff. We're going to select Recomp. This is the Reaper built-in compressor. And what we're going to do here is a quick and dirty version of what's called New York compression, which basically adds a very hyper-compressed drum line. And what we're going to do is mix that with the original drum line to give it a punchier sound. So if we hit space to listen to it, we're going to take a look at this meter over here. So it's kind of hanging out in this range. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what compression does, but basically what it does is it takes an audio signal and you set basically the ceiling level or the threshold level. And then what you're going to do is you're going to select a ratio afterwards. Now every time this audio signal goes past this threshold level, it's going to engage the compressor. And for every decibel that it goes over this point, it's going to apply the ratio. So if we have a ratio of 2.0, for every decibel it goes over this, it's only going to go up half a decibel. So it kind of squashes the sound. It makes it sound a bit more consistent. It can have a very noticeable dramatic effect if you really make it noticeable dramatic, or it can have a very subtle effect that just kind of smooths things out. For this, we're going to make it a really noticeable effect. We're going to look at where the level is again, set it probably about here, and we're going to set, maybe a bit lower, set the ratio to something really high like 6.0. And we're going to set it with a fast attack time. The attack time is how quickly this limiting effect comes into play once it starts playing. So we're going to set that down to 0 because there's nothing faster than 0. And now when we listen to it, it sounds like this. Let's actually lower this a bit more. So what you can probably hear through this is that the kick and the snare are taking precedence, and whenever those hit, it kind of sucks the energy away from the snares of the hi-hat. That really makes the kick and snare stand out, makes it sound punchier. But the problem is, obviously, it sounds horrible and weird by itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix that with the original sound. Since this track here represents the version with the compression, that weird sound on it, we're going to set this all the way down. listen to it normally, and then to taste, we're going to slide this up until we have just the right amount of the compression track and just the right amount of the rest of these. Okay, so once again, if we listen to it without the compressed track, with it. This adds a bit more punchiness to it. Now what we're going to do is go up to the parent track here, open the effects window, choose your favorite reverb, and we're going to add just a touch of reverb to make it sound a bit more like these were actually recorded instead of just being virtual drums. What I like to do is just add a little bit. There are a few different ways to do this, but we're just going to add it on the parent track. And so now, if we solo the reverb signal by setting the mix to 100, we can listen to it. There we go. Good. So there you have it. That's how you separate all your individual drum sounds. You can set up a compression sidechain effect to kind of give it that punchiness, and then route the whole thing through a master bus so you can apply effects to the whole thing. You could also do more EQing up here or something like that, whatever you want. Maybe add some chorus or a phaser if you're completely insane. But there you go. Now you can do a lot more with your drums. Hopefully it'll make your mixes sound a lot more professional. But keep in mind, all this stuff takes time, especially once you're doing the EQing. My recommendation is to set it up the way that sounds good, burn it onto a disc, or onto an iPod or whatever it is that you use to listen to music other places, and listen to it on as many different sound systems as you can. Different sound systems are going to bring out different parts of the EQ, and you're going to want to know what it is that your listeners are going to be listening to. It's fine and great if it sounds good on your equipment, but your equipment might have a blind spot in the EQ spectrum, and it might sound great to you, and then when you post it online or burn a disc or, God forbid, have professional copies printed up, if only then you realize that, you know, the low-end bass is really boomy and it destroys everything else, you're going to be pretty pissed at yourself. So do your homework up front, spend the time to make sure that your mix sounds good, and then get into doing all the rest of your stuff. What you can do is you can set up this whole thing as a template with the EZdrummer, the reverb, the drum compression, all that. If you go to File, Project Template, Save as Template, you can set that up. So next time you start a new song, you just open up that template and you already have all this stuff ready to go. Just delete the individual lines and create your new ones. So that's it for the third drum tutorial. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them in the video here or send me an email through YouTube. And until next time, keep the world metal.